Why is this conversation blocked in the political world? Because that's where the change could really happen. It was all over social media. If you look on social media, it's everywhere. Not just here in the UK, it's everywhere. But there's like, above us is the blanket of silence. And that is upsetting.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Emma Jane Taylor says our politicians aren't doing enough to tackle child sexual abuse, and that teaching kids about danger from strangers is the wrong focus.
And that 90% of children who are being sexually abused by people they know, yet we are looking at 10%, the stranger danger stat, when we talk to children at schools.
Emma says prison sentencing of child abusers is not tough enough.
If you've raped a child, abused a child, taken a child's childhood, because ultimately that's what you do, that child will now struggle through their life, then community services it's mind-boggling. Like I say, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute for me, and it doesn't match the crime.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Emma Jane Taylor, who is an entrepreneur and child sexual abuse campaigner. Emma Jane, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Lee.
Could you start by telling us your story and your journey to being a campaigner?
Yeah, of course. When I was 9 years old, I was away with my mother and stepfather on holiday, which isn't unusual. I lived with my mother and stepfather. I occasionally saw my biological father, and from time to time my siblings, step-siblings would visit, and I think, it was just a normal kind of environment for us to be on holiday. And while we were there, we would regularly go to a restaurant where the owners had animals, and all the kids flocked there in the evenings because we just all loved that sort of venue, and the parents would party and throw plates, and drink and eat. And it was just a place where we felt safe. We'd got to know in the couple of weeks that we'd been there. And then on this particular night, I'd gone out for dinner with my parents, and the restaurant owners did exactly what they were doing every night, entertaining the families, and then at a certain point took the children outside to see the animals. And it wasn't unusual, we'd done that a few times throughout the holiday. But this particular night, the restaurant owner, who'd become our friend, took us all out and then took me sort of a little bit away from the other children and sexually assaulted me. That was when I was around 9-10 years old. I could still hear the adults having fun, I could hear the music, you could hear the laughter, and it didn't feel right. I didn't know what it was actually. I was only 9. It was just something that had never happened to me before. And I ran back into the restaurant. I don't remember really anything else about that conversation after that. I just know that it was not something that had made me feel it was right, but I didn't know what. A couple of years later, I was in a car with my biological father, and with all sorts of story around it. He had told me he couldn't see me again, and that was it. I never saw him again. That left me really vulnerable, actually, and I think the memory of being 9 sort of caught up with me, and that kind of at 11, sort of 12 years old, there was a realisation that wasn't right, and I think maybe whatever I'd done around those few years of just blocking it out started resurfacing, and I began to clean and scrub and try and get clean at night. I was now really broken because my father had left, and whilst I had the stability of my mother and stepfather at home, there was a bit of a gap now because I felt really insecure. And then out of nowhere, a family acquaintance came into my life, my new friend. He was an older man, and I was a vulnerable child. And I think, classic, groomed everybody, groomed me, and then I was sexually abused for the next few years. So throughout those young years, 9 to 16, I really felt like my childhood was taken. And I guess it leaves open all sorts of conversations, which I'm sure we'll have today. But, you know, having now done some research, I realised our brains don't develop until late teens, early 20s. So no surprise to me then that, you know, the next few years were a bit of a car crash for me as I tried to as I struggled with emotions, with hurt, with rejection, with abuse, trying to understand it but not getting very far with any of those conversations. And I turned to, you know, anything I could, you know, drink, drugs. I became bulimic. I had traits where I just, you know, had to turn the lights on certain ways, getting cars a certain way, shut doors and things behind me. It was just all my way, my brain's way of, I think, just trying to cope with the utter chaos that this childhood trauma had brought to my life. And so that was really sort of, in a bit of a nutshell, that's my story. It was, you know, from 9 through to 16, just a very troubling time of being taken advantage of and being very hurt and damaged by, you know, people I knew, people I'd got to know. And I guess why I then moved on to do what I did as a campaigner and in charity.
Do we know the kind of figures of how many people or victims there are in the UK of child sexual abuse?
Do you know what, the numbers are so varied, and it's frustrating really, because you see 1 in 11, 1 in 9, 1 in 7, 1 in 6. I mean, I think it's like much higher. I think it, you know, we're looking at 1 in 3 easy. And I say that because I see the conversations online. I am in that space. People do contact me. I do get regular emails from people. And just through my own journey as a campaigner now, I see, I think even just the, you know, not even scratching the surface of this conversation, the amount of people who are talking about being abused, and more people are coming forward because so many more people are talking about it, but it's still an uncomfortable and ugly conversation for society to have, so they don't. And then so myself and other campaigners are banging on regularly about the importance of, you know, leaning into these conversations, listening to these conversations, taking them seriously, because they're ruining lives. And that's not why we've been given life, right? We've not been given life to have most of it taken from us by selfish, vile behaviours.
Looking back at my childhood, I remember a lot of talk about don't talk to strangers, don't accept sweets from strangers. What you're talking about is someone you knew. I know some of your campaigns focus on this as well. Can you talk to us a bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah, so, well, the campaign is called Not My Shame. And that was something I started a little bit accidentally, actually, Lee. I put a few quotes out a few years ago saying, you know, I was abused as a child, and, you know, I had significant moments throughout my childhood that caused me real trauma, but that wasn't my shame. And so I started using the Not My Shame as a bit of a hashtag for my own posts, for my own writing, and it allowed me to sort of put together, you know, string of words that were a bit more, you know, coherent. And so that was the Not My Shame. But around that, I started looking at the 90-10 stat and the seriousness of the 90-10 stat.
So that's 90%?
Yes, so we're looking at that 90% of children who are being sexually abused by people they know, yet we are looking at 10%, the stranger danger stat, when we talk to children at schools. Now, it's uncomfortable to talk about 90-10 stat to children, right? Because that's scary. You know, we don't want to scare kids. We don't want to put fear into them, but we need them to be protected. So the 90-10 statistic sort of came into my life. Project 90-10 is my charity, and that is really focused on the 90-10 stat and the reality of these conversations. At school, I was born in 1972, and everything was around stranger danger, and I think it still is to a degree. You know, I was told to scream and shout if, you know, someone had, pulled up in a white van and wanted to give me some sweets or invited me to go and see kittens and puppies. Well, that's just, it's just not happening. Now, I'm sure it is, right? But not on the scale that we were told it was as a child. It was terrifying as a child if a white van came past when you were walking home from school. And, sorry, white van drivers, but that was exactly what we were told as kids. But that wasn't the reality that I learnt and many others learnt as we went through our childhood. So, I was told to scream and shout if anyone tried to put me in their van, but no one told me to scream and shout if someone I knew did something sinister. And that is because no one believed or talked about it or even, thought it was something. And even today, I think people don't really believe it, but it's happening.
Well, why do you think there is such a focus on the stranger danger when all the evidence is pointing the other direction?
Stranger danger is a hangover from the sort of 20th century. And there seems to be no real studies and research into the reality of the child sexual abuse stat that I'm talking about. I see it, you see some of the charities talking about it, you see people online talking about it, but we don't see anything politically coming forward to talk about it because people are very scared of that conversation and very scared to share that with the world. But I don't see why they're too scared to share it, because actually if we really understand it, we don't just protect children, we also protect children for potentially becoming perpetrators because maybe they're not getting the education they need in their own home environments.
It feels in Britain there's been a bit more focus on child sexual abuse in recent years than there used to be. Do you think we are getting better at accepting that this is happening and looking at ways to deal with it?
Yeah, I think we are. I think we are accepting that it happens, but I think the narrative isn't reflecting the reality of it. This 90-10 statistic, and I will keep going on and on and on about it, is really, really important. There are abusers all across the world. There's no description of an abuser, right? They're hidden in plain sight. And if we could put a description to what a paedophile looked like, that would be great. That would be easy, wouldn't it? We'd be able to go into corners of society to sort those conversations, but we can't. And so unless the world gets better at really identifying this hidden in plain sight message and protecting children through education, I don't mean scaring children, I mean helping them protect themselves, so if they are ever faced in a situation where they could be potentially groomed by someone they know, that they know how to challenge it, that they know how to question or find someone to talk to about it, so that no more children go down the roads that I and many others did.
What practical steps can we take to actually make things better?
Well, I think first of all we need to get tougher with lots of things. Sentencing, believing victims. Victims who come forward won't just come forward because it's happened and they want to get it out there that moment. It will have been years and years and years and years and years before they've got to a moment where they feel that they can disclose or become public with it. And quite often you'll hear reports where people just won't be believed. Well, funny now talking about that when it happened 20 years ago kind of attitude. And it's like, well, actually, when you look at how the brain develops from a child, teenage years, young adult, the brain is still developing. Now, when you've had trauma, the brain, well, I can speak for myself here. I can tell you that I had a delayed onset of maturity because of trauma. So I didn't actually really process things till my late 20s. When I went into therapy for the first time. Now that's me, and I'm not saying I'm a carbon copy, but I know that most people I talk to about this are in their 20s before they start really sort of thinking, I want to talk about it with someone. I spoke to my friend, I wrote her a letter actually, and I remember sitting down with her to this day and sharing this sort of moment with her, and I thought that would be it, but actually that then snowballed to other things. So I think society needs to get better at believing someone disclosing. I mean, why anyone would disclose and that not be the truth, and for anyone to think that it isn't is beyond me. I mean, that's utterly bonkers on its own, you know. When someone gets to a point of disclosure, believe them. That needs to be into a legal process, and the law needs to move much quicker than it does. You know, at the moment, you see cases going on for years.
Yeah.
And you're like, wow. I mean, do you not understand the trauma of and the impact to that survivor? The fact they've got to disclosure. Now they've got to go through a lengthy legal process to get any kind of justice, and often never really justice, right? Because when you've had your life taken as a child through abuse, there'll never be justice for that. You know, you might be able to get to a point where you can, you know, see the paedophile in prison, but even if it was for life, that's never going to match what a child's had taken from them for their life, their one life. And so we need to get quicker on law process. We need to get better with prison sentences. Summer community service. I mean, for me, it's mind-boggling how anyone could put community service to a paedophile who has raped a child. Just doesn't equate. I mean, it just doesn't. I mean, even just saying those words, they just don't work, do they? I mean, if you've raped a child, abused a child, taken a child's childhood, because ultimately that's what you do, that child will now struggle through their life, then community service is just, I mean, it's mind-boggling. Like I say, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute for me, and it doesn't match the crime. So we need to get better at that. And we need to get these cases through the courts much quicker, because we need to support the victim and make sure that they are feeling like they are being well looked after. And I just don't think they feel that they are, because they don't feel society is really believing them, or the legal process is too long. It's making them feel confused. You know, I've had survivors struggle with their stories because of memory loss. And memory loss is a really important part of the legal process, and it needs to be better understood. When you've gone through trauma, quite often your bodies will manage the way they need. So your brain could shut down, you could have dissociation, maladaptive daydreaming, abreactions. I mean, I had all of that. But that was my body coping, and that, thank goodness, actually, because that allowed me just to switch off at those times where it was just too overwhelming.
So it's not people kind of forcing it out of their brain and choosing not to remember.
Yeah, and you know, when I look back into my school years, I remember being told off because, you know, I wasn't really concentrating. But, you know, I was a troubled child as well, and my brain was managing a lot of things, right? A lot of dark things. So, you know, nothing I really felt like I could talk about either. So I think once society starts understanding realities for children, for young adults, and starts believing legal cases get dealt with quicker, sentencing is much more appropriate. I mean, I'd much rather see a child rapist be inside from a minimum of life, right? Nothing less. I mean, nothing less, because it's just not, it's just not, it doesn't equate. So I'd really like to see that. But that has to come from the top, right? Yeah. And, you know, we don't see the political world really, really leaning in on these conversations. You know, it's all about, you know, making sure young adults are, you know, achieving and getting what they need in the education and mortgages and money and finances and new jobs and things like that. Well, that's all great. But if you've had your childhood stripped from you, you may never reach those dizzy heights of trying to get all the things that the government is rolling out for us all the time for the young adults, because you've had your childhood taken. You can't process things maybe as some others might be, and you're struggling, your mental health struggles. You need much more than being told to get a job and, you know, get married, get a mortgage. That's not what you need. You need support. You need leaderships to really understand the importance of supporting those that have gone through troubled childhoods.
Just taking a step back, it feels like paedophilia is this kind of ghost that's haunted Britain for a long time now. You hear about another celebrity who's involved and it almost doesn't feel shocking anymore. We've had the grooming gangs, abuse in church. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on why this keeps happening in Britain, why we have this ongoing problem.
Well, because no one's really going, it happens and we need to deal with it. So we continually hear about the problems, whether that be in church, in the authorities, in the grooming gangs, at home. When we get to a point where we have a leadership leading with these conversations and acknowledging that they happen and doing something about it, society will lean in. And once you get society leaning in to the conversations, you'll see things changing. You'll see better education rolled out. You'll see maybe more funding for survivors or education to protect children. But it's like there's this sort of ignorance. It's like this veil of ignorance around this conversation. But why doesn't anyone lean in and really understand that this is happening? I just don't understand, Lee. I don't understand. There's investment into children's school dinners. There's investment into better education. More money for books and pens and healthcare and for children, but nothing around this conversation to help children be better protected from being abused. I have no answers as to why. I am probably as confused as most people on this conversation. And until it gets really tackled, we can have people in, the political world now who are doing some wonderful things trying to raise that awareness, but they're just not scaling enough. And why aren't they scaling enough? Because they're getting blocked as well. So those are the bigger questions, right? Why is this conversation blocked in the political world? Because that's where the change could really happen. It's all right, you and me talking and other news channels and survivors and campaigners. It's all over social media. If you look on social media, it's everywhere. Not just here in the UK, it's everywhere. But there's above us is the blanket of silence. And that is upsetting. It's worrying. But I can't let that deter me from what I'm doing, which is raising awareness and doing what we can with the charity and the education programs to get into schools, which is where we're moving to now. So, at least I feel like I'm doing something.
So I know you, as well as your campaign, you started a charity that's working in this area. Can you tell us a bit about the work you do and how you deliver the message?
Yeah, so the charity is called Project 9010. 9010 stat being 90% of children being abused or being abused by people they know, and 10% is obviously, as we've talked around, children being abused by strangers. So, at the moment the statistic is much more about stranger danger education. We need to flip that. So I had a charity, was formed a few years ago. We have a strong board now, and we are now starting to do a lot of good work around pulling our education programs together. And the work we're doing is about going into schools to work with safeguarding teams, with parents and guardians, working with community, working with adults. We're not working with children directly because I don't believe that's the right thing for us to do. And I think it can be quite scary having these conversations with children. But if we can educate the safeguarding leads and the parents to understand things that they can look at, things that they can help their children with, understanding appropriate behaviour, understanding, who to trust, what when to trust and what to do if there's a problem, and healthy relationships, we can really start to help young people. And we're working with primary schools up to sort of senior schools, so it's all about empowering young people. So if they are ever faced with a difficult situation where they might have it could be a potential grooming situation, that they can challenge it. And like I say, we don't want to scare all the kids because it's not about that. It's about empowering them and helping society to really engage these conversations better. They're uncomfortable conversations to have, but until we start having more of them, no change is really going to happen. So engaging society, engaging communities. We're doing safeguarding in the community discussions now more and more, and just making sure that we at a level can protect the children and the next generations, because ultimately we want them to flourish. We want them to be able to achieve and find their way in society sooner and not struggle in silence.
I think we can safely assume there's quite a lot of survivors out there who are suffering in silence. I mean, what advice would you give them?
That they have no shame. It's not my shame, it's not their shame. They did nothing wrong. And when I first started swirling around with those words, I really did start thinking, no, I didn't do anything wrong. The shame of abuse is not mine. And a lot of survivors feel shame, embarrassed that this has happened to them, but they don't have that shame. It's not their shame, that's the abuser's shame. So first of all, it's turning that narrative around in your head, turning that narrative around in your world, sharing with people, if you can, your story. And, even if you don't want to share it publicly, and I think that always comes with a disclaimer for me, because actually going public, you need to really know why you're going public, what you're doing, because that can be quite damaging as well. If you haven't, got to a point where you feel strong enough and healed and able, that can set you right back as well. So understanding it's not your shame, maybe sharing your story with somebody, and I do believe therapy is a really good place to start. Now, I know lots of people can't afford therapy, and that again comes down to the leaderships and the, trying to get this kind of treatment on the NHS isn't easy either. So, maybe there needs to be better funding. And I did actually put together a petition actually a few years ago for survivors to be better funded by the leaderships, political leaders, and that didn't go very far. But that's what we need. We need funding for survivors, funding to help young people get through the trauma, funding to help adults get through the trauma so that they can flourish in their life. Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't survivors flourish? Not everyone can, they just struggle. So use the hashtag, talk to someone, if you can get therapy, definitely speak to someone professional, because I think they really do help you. Once you start getting it out, it really does help. I found writing very helpful, so I wrote my book. I don't advise people to do that again unless they feel comfortable and able to do that. I started blogging, I started vlogging, and suddenly I was like, oh, okay, I seem to be doing a lot of this. But if it's helping someone, then, I'm very proud of that, and it's quite humbling when people contact me now, because I just think if I can give someone, I'm not a therapist, but if I can give someone some hope just so they know they're not alone, then that will have been the best thing I could ever have achieved,
Talking about this is difficult, even for me, let alone for a victim. Can you talk to us about the challenges that you've been through to get to this point where you can publicly do this?
Well, I can tell you the first 2 times I spoke. One was at a media event where I knew the organiser, and I was writing my book, and she said, do you want to come and share it at the event? And I said, yeah, okay. And I went along, and it was just a very... it was a small room of people I knew, which actually I think was worse in the end, because I knew all these people, but they were really kind. I had a bit of paper and I was like shaking like this, but it was like, that was okay. That felt good. It felt good to have sort of shared my story, and that I was writing a book. And then not long after, I was invited to be in Venus Women magazine with talking about my business as a professional woman, and they wanted to put me on their front cover and do a bit of an article on the work that I was doing. And at the time I was also presenting for the wellbeing show for That's TV, and they wanted to do this thing on me as a fitness expert and in my lifestyle businesses working in performing arts. So I was like, absolutely fine. I said, would you mind if I touched on my personal story? Because I'd become to feel I felt like I had imposter syndrome, and, I thought, I just want to share a little bit of my story. it might car crash my career, but I suddenly felt this need to share what I'd gone through as a child. So they said, yeah, okay. And they did this interview with me, a video interview. They said, look, we'll use that for the article, and we'll put some bits together and put it out there. So it was very gentle. It was a very sort of gentle piece, just tiptoeing into the fact that I'd had some troubles as a young girl. And then they said, we've got this big event coming up at the Advocacy Stadium, football stadium. Would you be a compare with Tara Hamilton, one of the organisers? I said, yeah, absolutely. And then they said, would you mind if we shared your story, your video story, on the screens? I said, yeah, go on, go for it. Well, maybe I should have thought about that, because there's about 400 people at this event. And there was a bit of hype, and we were all getting changed, ready to go on. And I knew the magazine was out, and they were going to ask me to come on stage to talk about my story, and I'd okayed this video. But as I was walked to the runway, the screens lit up with me talking about my story. But not just one screen, I mean like 5 screens. And I had family and friends on one table listening, and obviously they knew my story, but now suddenly it was lit up like a Christmas tree, and there I was openly talking about my story. And I felt absolutely terrified, because it was really coming out. Anyway, I was led onto the stage, and I remember thinking, I'm going to pass out, I'm going to be sick, I can't do it. And I was shaking, absolutely nervous as I've just never been that nervous before. It's like my whole body was like turning inside out. I don't know, it was just weird. And then the room fell silent. And then at one point I said, look, I'm really sorry, can I stop for a second? Because it was all overwhelming. And so I did, I stopped. And you almost felt like the room went, and then I continued. And that was that. I came home, went to bed, didn't really sleep very well. And the next day, my inbox absolutely gone to pieces with people contacting me. Thank you for sharing your story, and I've been a victim of child sexual abuse. You made me feel less alone, and it just went on and on and on and on. And then I went onto Facebook, and it was all over Facebook in my inbox, and people talking about it. And it was really like, okay, this is bigger than I'd expected. But when I then saw the messages, I was like, okay, it's helped people, and that's why I did this. And so those were the first few times I sort of publicly went out with my story. And then, like I say, my book followed not long afterwards. And I remember talking to another author who I know, and I shared with him what I'd written sort of about my story. And I put, my name's Emma Jane Taylor. I was born in 1972. I grew up in Marlow, Buckinghamshire. And I've experienced a bit of a traumatic childhood, but this is how I got through it. And he was like, EJ, that's not enough. That's not enough. People need to know your story. That's how people will relate to you. So I filled it out a bit more. He was like, no, nowhere close. Filled it out a bit more. And then suddenly I'd done a big, long description of my story. And then he was like, that's it. And the book went out. So that was sort of the initial stages. That was at the beginning. And, that really was a bit of a between the eyes moment when I thought this could really car crash my career. But I don't care now. I feel like I'm me. I feel like I've allowed myself to truly be who I need to be. And I was around 44, 45 at that time. And then the campaign really sort of started pushing on a few years after that.
What kind of response have you had? Because, I'm sure you would get a lot of very positive responses from people thanking you, but at the same time, you're exposing some quite dangerous people with these campaigns.
Yeah, you get people come up everywhere. I get trolled more, maybe because my profile's raised, but I don't know if that's because of what I'm talking about or whether it's just people so bored they want to target vulnerable people. Well, thank goodness for the block button. But, you know, one thing I won't do is entertain that kind of behaviour online or anywhere, actually, because I think it's ugly and it doesn't really, it's not productive. So I want to be productive. My work is about empowering other people to find their voice, to understand they've got no shame, and to help society understand the reality of the 90-10 stat, to protect children. When I do come up across anything, I just walk past, you know. I mean, I don't, maybe a few years ago it would have been different, but now I just think there's just a lot of people online trying to tear people apart, you know, whoever you are. If you respond, you'll get a reaction that, you know, you'll react to something that they want you to react to, and then it becomes bigger than it should be, and then that takes me away from what I want to do, and I don't want to be there. You know, I've been in enough places through my childhood to know that I don't want to be back in those uncertain, vulnerable times, so I just push through. Not everyone's going to like me, but if I've unlocked and helped more people than, you know, the odd troll, then I'm happy with that.
Imogen Taylor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lee. It's been lovely to speak to you.